I never thought a simple family dinner could shatter my 8-year-old son's world in under 30 seconds. We sat around my father's mahogany dining table, the same one where I'd eaten countless meals, growing up sharing what seemed like ordinary conversation about school and upcoming projects. Tyler picked at his mashed potatoes while my sister Melody bragged about her daughter Chloe's latest academic achievements. The atmosphere felt warm and familiar until my father Frank cleared his throat with that particular authority he'd always wielded over our family gatherings. His next words cut through the room like a blade through silk. "You know what I've been thinking," he announced, gesturing toward my niece with obvious pride. "Your niece and her sisters are the only ones in this family who'll actually make something of themselves. Not like your boy there." The laughter that followed from Melody and Frank echoed off the walls, while Tyler's fork clattered against his plate, his young face crumpling with a pain I recognized all too well. The silence that followed my father's cruel assessment stretched for what felt like an eternity before I set down my water glass with deliberate calm. Something inside me shifted, a protective fury that had been building for months, finally reaching its breaking point. I looked directly at my sister, noting how her confident smile wavered slightly under my steady gaze before turning back to my father. "You know what, Dad? That's actually really helpful to hear," I said, keeping my voice level despite the rage churning in my chest. "Since you're so confident that Chloe is the only one with potential in this family, I think it makes perfect sense for me to stop paying her $1,700 monthly tuition at Riverside Academy." The transformation in the room was immediate and electric. Melody's face drained of all color, her mouth falling open as she stared at me in shock. Frank's confident demeanor crumbled as he processed what I'd just said, his eyes darting between me and my sister with growing panic. "Norton, what are you talking about?" Melody stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't pay Chloe's tuition. I handle all her school expenses myself." I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app, scrolling to the automatic monthly transfers I'd been making for the past 3 years. "Really? Because according to Wells Fargo, I've been transferring exactly $1,700 to Riverside Academy every month since September of 2021. That's when you lost your marketing position at Henderson Creative. Remember, Eve?" Frank reached across the table and grabbed my forearm, his fingers digging into my skin with desperate pressure. "Please, Norton, not here. We can discuss this privately later." "Oh, we're definitely going to discuss this," I replied gently but firmly, removing his hand from my arm. "But first, let's make sure everyone understands exactly what's been happening in this family for the past few years." I turned my phone screen toward them, showing the detailed transaction history that painted a clear picture of my financial support. "See this recurring payment every 15th of the month, $1,700 to Riverside Academy for Chloe's tuition and fees, and this one on the third $450 for Dad's diabetes medication and blood pressure pills. Oh, and this beauty right here every first of the month, $325 for Melody's Honda Accord payment." Tyler looked up from his plate for the first time since Frank's devastating comment, his young eyes wide with understanding as he processed the numbers I was rattling off. Meanwhile, Melody had gone completely silent, her hands trembling as she clutched her napkin. "You see," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each revelation, "while you've both been treating Tyler and me like we're some kind of family disappointments, I've actually been the one keeping this whole operation afloat. Funny how that works, isn't it?" Frank's face had turned an alarming shade of red as he struggled to process the implications of what I was sharing. "Son, I had no idea you were helping with Melody's expenses. She told me she'd found another job." "Did she now?" I asked, raising an eyebrow as I turned to my sister. "Melody, would you like to tell Dad about this amazing new job you've had for the past 3 years? The one that somehow allows you to afford private school tuition for Chloe while living in that beautiful apartment downtown." Melody's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began streaming down her cheeks as she looked between Frank and me, clearly realizing that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time. "I was going to tell you both," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I just didn't want Dad to worry, and I knew Norton could afford it, so I thought it would just be temporary until I got back on my feet." 3 years, Melody. I said, my tone becoming sharper. 3 years of letting Dad believe you were handling everything yourself while I quietly covered your expenses. 3 years of family dinners where you and Dad made jokes about Tyler's potential while I funded your daughter's elite education. The weight of these revelations seemed to press down on everyone at the table. Frank looked completely deflated, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious shame and confusion. Tyler had stopped eating entirely, watching this adult drama unfold with the serious attention of a child who was beginning to understand that the family dynamics he'd always accepted were far more complicated than he'd realized. "But Norton," Frank said weakly, "you never said anything. How were we supposed to know?" I leaned back in my chair, studying my father's face with new clarity. "Dad, in the past year alone, how many times have you told me that Tyler needed to apply himself more? How many family gatherings have included comments about how he should be more like his cousins? How many times have you suggested that maybe I'm not pushing him hard enough academically?" Frank opened his mouth to respond, but then closed it again, clearly unable to come up with an answer that wouldn't make things worse. The thing is, I continued, I never minded helping family. That's what we do for people we love. But watching you tear down my son's confidence while I'm literally paying for the success you're using to belittle him, that crosses a line I didn't even know existed until tonight. The silence that followed my financial revelations was heavy with unspoken tension, but I knew I wasn't finished yet. There was a deeper truth that needed to come to light, one that would help them understand why their casual cruelty toward Tyler carried consequences they'd never even considered. Actually, there's something else you both need to understand about why tonight's comments were particularly devastating, I said, pulling out my phone again and opening a folder labeled Legal Documents. Tyler's mother, Sandra, has been building a custody case against me for the past 8 months. Both Frank and Melody straightened in their chairs, suddenly paying attention with laser focus. Tyler looked up at me with surprise, clearly not aware that I'd been dealing with this legal battle. Sandra's attorney has been collecting evidence to prove that I'm an unfit father and that Tyler would be better off living with her full-time instead of our current 50-50 arrangement. I continued, my voice steady, despite the emotional weight of what I was sharing. They've been particularly interested in documenting how my own family treats Tyler compared to his cousins. Frank's face went pale as the implications began sinking in. "Norton, surely you don't think that our family conversations would be relevant to a custody hearing?" "Oh, but they absolutely are," I replied, opening a voice recording app on my phone. Sandra's lawyer specifically instructed her to gather evidence about Tyler's home environment, including how he's treated by extended family members. Every time Tyler comes home from a family gathering feeling inadequate or stupid, Sandra documents it. I held up my phone, showing them the recording that had been running throughout our dinner conversation. In fact, tonight's dinner has been recorded in its entirety. Sandra's attorney will be very interested in hearing my father tell my 8-year-old nephew that he'll never amount to anything significant. Melody gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth as she realized the legal ramifications of their behavior. "Norton, you can't possibly use family conversations against us in court. That's not fair." "What's not fair, Melody, is that I've been fighting to maintain joint custody of my son, while my own family provides ammunition to his mother's legal team," I replied firmly. "Let me read you something from Sandra's most recent court filing." I pulled out a printed document from my jacket pocket, unfolding it carefully before reading aloud. According to the petitioner's observations, the minor child consistently returns from paternal family gatherings with decreased self-esteem and reports feeling inferior to his cousins. The petitioner believes that the paternal extended family environment is detrimental to the child's emotional development and academic confidence. Frank had gone completely silent, his earlier bravado replaced by obvious horror as he understood how his words might sound in a courtroom setting. Tyler was staring at me with wide eyes, clearly processing the idea that these family dinners had been part of a larger legal battle. But surely the courts wouldn't take family teasing seriously, Frank said weakly, though his voice lacked conviction. Dad let me play you something from last month's barbecue, I said, scrolling through my phone to find another recording. This is from when Sandra came to pick up Tyler and you spoke with her directly about his academic future. I pressed play, and Frank's voice filled the dining room with crystal clarity. Sandra, I have to be honest with you. Tyler's a sweet kid, but he's just not academically inclined like his cousin Chloe. She's definitely Harvard material, but Tyler? He'll probably end up at the community college if he's lucky. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake while Melody covered her face with both hands in obvious mortification. Sandra's attorney plans to use that exact quote in their argument that even my own father considers me an inadequate parent who's raising an academically inferior child. I continued. They're building a case that Tyler needs to be removed from an environment where his own grandfather publicly declares him a failure. Tyler finally spoke up, his young voice cutting through the adult tension with startling maturity. Dad, is that why you always ask me about school so much lately, because you're worried Mom might try to take me away? I reached over and placed my hand gently on Tyler's shoulder, meeting his concerned gaze with honest acknowledgement. Yes, buddy. Mom thinks you might be happier living with her full time, and she's been trying to prove that our family situation isn't good for you. But I don't want to live with Mom full time, Tyler said immediately, his voice growing stronger. I like living with both of you, and I especially like the weeks when I'm here with you. Frank looked stricken as he watched this exchange, clearly realizing that his careless words had been actively undermining his own son's relationship with his grandson. Norton, I had no idea. If I'd known about the custody situation, I never would have said those things to Sandra. But you did say them, Dad, I replied quietly. And you've been saying similar things about Tyler for months, not caring how they might affect him or me. The custody battle just gives those words legal consequences instead of just emotional ones. Melody finally looked up from her hands, her makeup streaked with tears. What can we do to fix this? Is there any way to help your case instead of hurting it? I studied both of their faces, noting the genuine distress and newfound understanding in their expressions. Actually, there might be. But first, you both need to understand something important about Tyler that you've been completely ignoring. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila folder I'd brought specifically for this moment, knowing that eventually I'd need to defend my son against their misconceptions. The weight of the documents inside felt substantial, representing years of Tyler's achievements that I deliberately kept private to protect him from family dynamics I was only now beginning to fully address. Since you're both so concerned about Tyler's academic future, let me share some information about what he's actually been accomplishing while you've been focused on comparing him unfavorably to his cousins, I said, opening the folder and spreading several certificates and letters across the mahogany table. Frank leaned forward, adjusting his reading glasses as he examined the documents. His expression shifted from confusion to surprise as he read the letterheads and official seals that decorated each piece of paper. Tyler, come here for a minute, buddy, I said gently, and my son moved from his chair to stand beside me, his curiosity overcoming his earlier distress. I picked up the first certificate and held it so everyone could see clearly. This is Tyler's first place award from the Regional Mathematics Competition held at UC Berkeley last spring. He competed against over 200 students from across Northern California and scored in the 98th percentile. Tyler's face lit up with pride as I displayed his achievement, while Melody and Frank stared at the official document with obvious shock. But Tyler, you never mentioned winning a math competition. Melody said, her voice filled with bewilderment. Why didn't you tell us about this Tyler looked up at me for guidance before answering quietly. Dad said I should keep my school stuff private unless someone specifically asked about it. He said some people might feel bad if I talked about winning things all the time. I nodded, remembering the conversation we'd had after Tyler's first competition victory. I taught him not to brag because I wanted him to stay humble, but also because I noticed that family gatherings became more pleasant when Tyler didn't mention his academic successes. Frank's face flushed with what I recognized as shame mixed with defensive anger. Norton, are you suggesting that we would have been jealous of Tyler's achievements? I'm not suggesting anything, Dad. I'm stating facts, I replied, pulling out another document. This is a letter from Tyler's computer science teacher at Lincoln Elementary. Tyler created a mobile application that helps children with reading disabilities practice phonetic recognition through interactive games. I handed the letter to Frank, watching his eyes widen as he read the teacher's detailed description of Tyler's programming project. The app has been downloaded over 5,000 times since Tyler uploaded it to the educational software platform last fall. I continued. His teacher submitted it to the State Department of Education as an example of exceptional student innovation. Melody reached across the table to examine the letter, her expression shifting from skepticism to amazement as she processed what she was reading. Tyler actually programmed a working mobile application at 8 years old. 9 years old now, Tyler corrected politely, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. And I'm working on a new one that helps kids learn multiplication tables through space exploration games. Frank set down the letter and looked directly at Tyler, his voice much quieter than usual. Tyler, I had no idea you were interested in computer programming. How did you learn how to create applications? Dad teaches me on weekends, Tyler replied matter-of-factly. We work on coding projects together in his home office. I also watch online tutorials and read programming books from the library. I pulled out the next set of documents determined to complete the picture of Tyler's actual capabilities. These are Tyler's standardized test scores from last semester. He scored in the 99th percentile in mathematics and the 96th percentile in reading comprehension. Melody studied the official score reports, comparing Tyler's results to national averages and grade-level expectations. These scores are incredible, Norton. Tyler is performing at a high school level in mathematics. Actually, I said, reaching for the final document in my folder, that brings me to the most important piece of information you need to understand about Tyler's academic future. I unfolded a letter bearing the official logo and letterhead of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, watching Frank and Melody's expressions change dramatically as they recognized the prestigious institution's seal. Tyler has been accepted into MIT's summer program for gifted young scholars. I announced holding the acceptance letter so they could read it clearly. This is a highly competitive program that accepts only 60 students nationwide between the ages of 8 and 12. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Frank stared at the MIT letterhead as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing, while Melody's mouth hung open in obvious shock. The program runs for 6 weeks during the summer and focuses on advanced mathematics, computer science, and scientific research methods. I continued. Tyler will be working alongside graduate students and faculty members on real research projects. Tyler beamed with pride as I described his summer opportunity, clearly enjoying the chance to finally share his achievements with his extended family. But Norton, Frank said slowly, his voice filled with confusion and what sounded like genuine remorse. If Tyler is this academically gifted, why didn't you ever tell us we had no idea he was achieving at such a high level? I carefully gathered Tyler's certificates and letters back into the folder before answering, choosing my words deliberately. Dad, I kept Tyler's achievements private because I wanted to protect him from exactly what happened at tonight's dinner, I said firmly. I've watched how this family responds to academic competition, and I didn't want Tyler to become a target for jealousy or resentment. Melody looked stricken as she processed my explanation. Are you saying we would have treated Tyler badly if we'd known about his accomplishments? I'm saying that Chloe's academic success has always been celebrated loudly and frequently at family gatherings, while any mention of Tyler's interests or achievements has been dismissed or minimized. I replied, tonight's dinner was just the most explicit example of a pattern that's been going on for years. Frank removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, clearly struggling with the realization that he'd been completely wrong about his grandson's potential. Tyler, Frank said, looking directly at his grandson with newfound respect, I owe you a sincere apology. I said something very unfair and untrue about your future, and I was completely wrong. Tyler studied his grandfather's face carefully before responding with characteristic thoughtfulness. It's okay, Grandpa. Dad explained that sometimes people say mean things when they don't understand the whole situation. The maturity and grace in Tyler's response seemed to hit Frank particularly hard, and I watched my father's eyes fill with tears as he contemplated how badly he'd misjudged his own grandson. But there's something else you all need to understand about Tyler's education, I said, deciding it was time to reveal the full extent of what had been happening behind the scenes. While I've been paying for Chloe's expensive private school tuition, Tyler has been achieving all of this academic success in regular public school without any tutoring or special programs. As Frank struggled to process the revelation about Tyler's genuine academic achievements, I realized there was an even deeper layer of deception that needed to be addressed. The comfortable assumptions my family had been operating under for the past several months were about to be thoroughly demolished, and I found myself almost curious to see how they would react to the next piece of information. Actually, Dad, since we're being completely honest about family finances tonight, there's something else we need to discuss, I said, my voice taking on a more serious tone as I prepared to reveal what I discovered about their recent business venture. Frank straightened in his chair, clearly sensing that more uncomfortable truths were about to emerge. Melody had grown very quiet, her earlier tears replaced by what looked like growing panic, as she seemed to anticipate where this conversation might be heading. 3 months ago, you approached me about investing in Melody's new consulting business. I continued watching Frank's expression shift from confusion to obvious discomfort. You were very excited about her entrepreneurial spirit and asked if I'd be willing to provide startup funding for what you described as a boutique marketing firm. Tyler listened to this adult conversation with the serious attention he always gave to family discussions, though I could see he didn't fully understand the business implications of what I was describing. I remember that conversation clearly, Frank said carefully, his voice lacking its usual confidence. You were very generous to support Melody's business goals. Yes, I was generous. I agreed, pulling out my phone and opening a banking application. I transferred $50,000 into Melody's business account on March 15th, based on the business plan she presented and your personal recommendation of her project. Melody had gone completely pale, her hands trembling as she clutched her water glass. She was staring at the table as if she could somehow disappear if she avoided making eye contact with anyone. The business plan was quite impressive. I continued conversationally. Professional office space, high-end marketing software, initial client contracts already secured. Melody projected that she'd be able to repay the startup loan within 18 months and potentially offer me a return on my investment. Frank nodded slowly, though I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression as he tried to remember the exact details of the business proposal. So naturally, I've been very curious about how the consulting firm has been progressing, I said, my tone becoming sharper. I've been looking forward to seeing the office space and meeting some of Melody's new clients. I turned to my sister, who was still avoiding eye contact with everyone at the table. Melody, would you like to tell Dad and Tyler about how the marketing consulting business has been developing? Maybe share some success stories from your first few months of operation? The silence stretched for nearly a full minute before Melody finally looked up, her eyes red with unshed tears and her face etched with obvious guilt. Norton, I can explain, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Please do, I replied, keeping my tone level despite the anger building in my chest. I'm sure Dad would love to hear about your business accomplishments, especially since he was so confident in recommending your project to me. Frank looked back and forth between Melody and me, clearly sensing that something was very wrong, but not yet understanding the full scope of the problem. The truth is, Melody began, her voice breaking, there is no consulting business. There never was. Frank's mouth fell open as he processed this admission, his expression shifting from confusion to horror as the implications became clear. I used the money to pay off my credit card debts. Melody continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I owed almost $30,000, and I was behind on payments. I was terrified that I was going to lose my apartment. And the other $20,000, I asked, though I already knew the answer from the private investigator's report I'd commissioned. I took a trip to Europe with my friend Jessica. She admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. We went to Italy and France for 3 weeks. I told myself I deserved a vacation after being unemployed for so long. The silence that followed was deafening. Frank stared at his daughter as if he'd never seen her before, while Tyler watched this adult drama unfold with wide eyes that seemed to understand more than his years should allow. Dad, I said, turning to Frank with deliberate calm, did you know that Melody had no intention of starting a legitimate business when you encouraged me to invest $50,000 in her non-existent consulting firm? Frank opened and closed his mouth several times before finally finding his voice. Norton, I swear to you I had no idea. Melody showed me a complete business plan with financial projections and everything. I truly believed she was starting a real company. Actually, Dad, that's not entirely accurate, I said, pulling out another document from my jacket pocket. This is a text message conversation between you and Melody from 2 weeks before she asked me for the investment money. I held up my phone, showing Frank a screenshot of messages I'd obtained through legal discovery processes. Would you like me to read your exact words? Or would you prefer to tell us yourself what you really knew about Melody's business plans? Frank's face had turned an alarming shade of red as he realized that I had access to private communications he'd assumed would remain secret. The text message shows you telling Melody that I would never miss $50,000 because I'm good with computers and probably make more than that in a month. I continued reading directly from the screen. You also wrote that I'm too trusting with family and would probably give her the money without asking too many questions. Melody buried her face in her hands, sobbing openly as the full extent of their deception was revealed. Frank looked completely defeated, his earlier defensiveness replaced by obvious shame. But the most interesting part, I said, scrolling to another message, is where you wrote that even if I eventually discovered there was no real business, I wouldn't take legal action against family because Norton always puts family loyalty above money. Tyler spoke up for the first time during this revelation, his young voice cutting through the adult tension with startling directness. Dad, did Grandpa and Aunt Melody steal money from you? I looked down at my son's concerned face, struck by how clearly he'd understood the situation despite its complexity. Yes, buddy. They took money from me by lying about how they planned to use it. That's called fraud, Tyler said matter-of-factly. We learned about it in social studies when we studied business ethics. Frank winced at Tyler's accurate assessment, clearly realizing that even his 9-year-old grandson could recognize the criminal nature of what they'd done. Norton, Frank said desperately, please understand that I never intended for this to hurt you. I genuinely believed that Melody would find a way to pay you back eventually. Dad, you conspired with Melody to defraud me of $50,000 while simultaneously allowing both of you to treat my son like he's intellectually inferior, I replied firmly. The money is one thing, but the disrespect toward Tyler while you were literally stealing from me, that's something else entirely. I reached into my jacket and pulled out one final document, this one bearing the official seal of the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. Which brings me to the legal resolution of this situation. I said, unfolding the document so they could see the official letterhead clearly. I filed a formal complaint for financial fraud with the district attorney's office last week. Melody's sobbing intensified as she realized the legal consequences of their actions, while Frank stared at the official document with obvious terror. The DA's office has opened an investigation into wire fraud and conspiracy charges, I continued. They're particularly interested in the text message evidence showing premeditation and deliberate deception. Frank reached across the table toward me with desperation in his eyes. Norton, please. Surely we can work this out within the family without involving criminal charges. I studied my father's face, noting the genuine fear and remorse in his expression before responding with careful consideration. Actually, Dad, there might be a way to resolve this situation that doesn't involve criminal prosecution, I said slowly. But it would require complete honesty and significant changes in how this family operates going forward. The weight of the fraud revelation was still settling over the dinner table when I realized there was one final piece of information that would complete the picture of our family's actual financial relationships. Frank and Melody were both staring at the district attorney's document with obvious terror, but I knew they needed to understand the full scope of their dependence on my generosity before we could move forward. Before we discuss potential resolutions to the fraud charges, there's one more thing you both need to understand about your current living situations. I said, my voice taking on the tone I used during difficult business negotiations. Frank looked up from the legal document, his face already showing signs of dread as he anticipated another unwelcome revelation. Dad, do you remember 2 years ago when you were facing foreclosure on this house? I asked, gesturing around the dining room where we'd shared so many family meals over the years. Frank's expression shifted to confusion mixed with obvious discomfort. Of course I remember. It was a very difficult time financially, but I managed to work things out with the bank. Actually, you didn't work things out with the bank, I corrected gently. I worked things out with the bank. The silence that followed was profound as Frank processed what I'd just said. Melody looked back and forth between us, clearly not understanding the implications of this new information. What do you mean, Norton? Frank asked slowly, though his voice suggested he was beginning to suspect the answer. I pulled out my phone and opened a different banking application, one that showed mortgage payments and property management expenses. 2 years ago, when Wells Fargo was preparing to foreclose on this house due to your gambling debts, I purchased your mortgage from the bank for $120,000. Frank's face went completely white as the reality of his situation became clear. You bought my mortgage, but the bank told me the foreclosure had been canceled because I'd brought my payments current. The foreclosure was canceled because I paid off your entire debt to Wells Fargo and assumed ownership of your mortgage. I explained, showing him the official documents on my phone screen. You've been living in my house for the past 2 years. Melody gasped audibly as she understood what this meant for Frank's financial independence. Dad, you don't own your house anymore. Technically, Frank has been renting from me, I continued, though I've never charged him rent or asked him to sign a formal lease agreement. I've also been paying the property taxes, homeowner's insurance, and all major maintenance costs. Frank stared at me with a mixture of shock and growing humiliation as he realized how completely dependent he'd become on my financial support. But Norton, why didn't you tell me? Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea you'd bought my mortgage. I thought I was living in my own home. I didn't tell you because I wanted to preserve your dignity, I replied honestly. I knew you'd be embarrassed about losing your house, so I structured the arrangement to let you believe you'd solve the problem yourself. Tyler had been listening to this conversation with the serious attention he always gave to adult discussions, and now he spoke up with characteristic directness. Dad, does this mean Grandpa has been living in your house while saying mean things about me? Tyler asked, his young voice cutting straight to the heart of the matter. The simplicity and accuracy of Tyler's question seemed to hit Frank particularly hard. He looked at his grandson with obvious shame before turning back to me. Norton, I feel sick thinking about how I've treated you and Tyler while you've been supporting me financially. Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. I had no idea about any of this. The property taxes alone are $8,000 per year. I continued pulling up the detailed expense records, plus homeowners' insurance maintenance and repairs. Last month, I paid $3,000 to replace the roof after those winter storms. I showed him the receipts from the roofing company, along with bills from the plumber, electrician, and landscaping service I'd been using to maintain his property. But how is this possible? Melody asked, still struggling to process the scope of her father's dependence on Norton's generosity. Dad always talks about this house like he owns it outright. Because I've allowed him to maintain that illusion, I replied. When friends or neighbors ask about the house, I've never corrected Frank's claims of ownership. I wanted him to feel secure and respected in his own community. Frank buried his face in his hands, clearly overwhelmed by the realization of how thoroughly I'd been supporting his lifestyle while he'd been undermining my relationship with Tyler. The irony is profound, isn't it? I continued, my voice becoming sharper. You've been sitting in my house, eating dinner at my table, while telling my son that he'll never amount to anything significant. You've been living on my charity, while criticizing my parenting and questioning Tyler's potential. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out one final document, this one prepared by my attorney earlier in the week. Which brings me to the legal reality of your housing situation. I said, unfolding the official notice and placing it on the table where Frank could read it clearly. Frank's hands trembled as he picked up the document and read the heading, Notice to Quit and Demand for Possession of Real Property. This is an eviction notice. Frank said, his voice barely audible as he processed what he was reading. Yes, it is, I confirmed. It gives you 30 days to vacate the property or pay the $120,000 you owe on the mortgage plus 2 years of back rent at fair market value. Melody read the eviction notice over Frank's shoulder, her face growing pale as she understood the implications. Norton, you can't possibly be serious about evicting Dad. Where would he live? That's not really my problem, is it? I replied calmly. Frank is a grown man who chose to gamble away his house while simultaneously treating my son with contempt and disrespect. The natural consequences of those choices are his responsibility, not mine. Frank looked up from the eviction notice with tears in his eyes. Norton, please don't do this. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I'm still your father. You're absolutely right, you are my father. I agreed. Which makes your behavior toward Tyler even more inexcusable. You're his grandfather, and you've been systematically undermining his confidence while living on my charity. Tyler reached over and took my hand, offering quiet support as he watched this difficult family confrontation unfold. His presence reminded me why I was fighting this battle and what was truly at stake. I prepared this eviction notice before tonight's dinner. I continued, because I've been documenting the pattern of emotional abuse toward Tyler for months. Tonight's comment about his future was simply the final straw. Frank stared at the legal document with obvious desperation, clearly trying to figure out how to resolve a situation that seemed completely hopeless. However, I said, my tone softening slightly, there might be a way to avoid eviction and criminal prosecution if you're both willing to make some fundamental changes in how you treat Tyler and respect our family relationship. As the weight of the eviction notice and fraud charges settled over the table, I expected Frank and Melody to immediately start bargaining or making desperate promises. Instead, something unexpected happened that would change the entire dynamic of our family forever. Tyler, who had been quietly listening to this adult drama unfold, suddenly pushed back his chair and stood up with a maturity and presence that commanded everyone's attention. Can I say something? Tyler asked, his young voice steady and clear despite the tension in the room. I nodded, curious about what my 9-year-old son wanted to contribute to this complex family confrontation. Tyler walked over to his backpack, which he'd left by the front door, and returned carrying a small notebook with a worn blue cover. He set it on the table in front of Frank and Melody before sitting back down in his chair. "This is my family journal," Tyler announced, opening the notebook to reveal pages filled with his careful handwriting. "Dad taught me to write down important things that happen, so I've been keeping track of family dinners and visits for the past 8 months." Frank and Melody stared at the journal with growing apprehension, clearly understanding that Tyler had been documenting their behavior toward him. "I want to read you some of the things I wrote down." Tyler continued, his voice remaining calm and factual. "Not because I want to be mean, but because I think you should know what it feels like to be me at family dinners." He flipped to a page marked with a small paper clip and began reading aloud. "March 23rd. Grandpa Frank told Mom that Chloe is definitely going to be valedictorian of her high school class, but I'll probably struggle to graduate. Aunt Melody laughed and said I'm a sweet kid, but not very bright. I went to the bathroom and cried for 10 minutes. Dad found me and said we could leave early if I wanted. The silence that followed Tyler's reading was deafening. Frank's face had gone completely white while Melody covered her mouth with both hands in obvious horror. Tyler flipped to another marked page and continued reading. April 15th. Family barbecue at Grandpa's house. Chloe showed everyone her science fair project about solar energy. Everyone was very excited and took lots of pictures. When I tried to show my programming project on Dad's laptop, Grandpa Frank said nobody wanted to see computer games and that I should go play outside instead. Aunt Melody said I spend too much time on screens anyway. Dad looked angry but didn't say anything. Frank tried to interrupt, but Tyler held up his small hand with surprising authority. I'm not finished yet, Tyler said firmly. There's more you need to hear. He turned to a more recent entry and began reading again. November 8th, Thanksgiving dinner. Grandpa Frank told everyone at the table that Chloe will probably get into an Ivy League college, but he's worried about my future because I don't seem motivated. Aunt Melody said maybe I have a learning disability that hasn't been diagnosed yet. Uncle Brad said some kids are just late bloomers, but Grandpa Frank said he doesn't think I'm a late bloomer, just not very academic. I wrote down exactly what they said because Dad always tells me to be accurate about important events. Melody had begun crying again, but these tears seemed different from her earlier ones, filled with genuine remorse rather than self-pity. Tyler closed the journal and looked directly at Frank with an expression far too mature for his 9 years. Grandpa Frank, I want you to know that I've always known exactly what you and Aunt Melody think about me, Tyler said quietly. I'm not stupid even though you think I am. I understand when adults are being mean, even when they pretend they're just being honest. Frank's composure finally cracked completely. He buried his face in his hands and began sobbing with the kind of deep, wrenching grief that comes from truly understanding the harm you've caused. Tyler, I'm so sorry, Frank managed to say through his tears. I never realized how cruel I was being. I thought I was just making casual observations. But here's the thing, Grandpa. Tyler continued, his voice remaining steady and thoughtful. I never wanted you and Aunt Melody to like me anyway, because I figured out that you're not very nice people. The simple honesty of this statement from a 9-year-old seemed to hit both adults like a physical blow. I realized that people who take money from my dad while being mean to both of us aren't the kind of people whose opinions matter, Tyler explained. Dad taught me that character is more important than anything else, and you both have shown me your character. Tyler opened his journal to the very last entry dated earlier that evening. I wrote this before dinner tonight, Tyler said. I want to read it to you now. He cleared his throat and began reading his final entry. I think tonight might be the night when Dad finally tells Grandpa Frank and Aunt Melody the truth about how they treat us. Dad has been very patient, but I can tell he's getting tired of their meanness. I hope he knows that I don't need them to love me or think I'm smart, because I already know who I am. I'm proud to be Dad's son, and I don't care if Grandpa Frank thinks I'm not as good as Chloe. Dad and I know the truth about what I can do, and that's enough for me. The wisdom and emotional maturity in Tyler's words left everyone at the table speechless. Even I found myself struggling to process the depth of understanding my son had developed about our family situation. Tyler closed his journal and turned to face me directly. Dad, I want to tell you something important. Tyler said, his young voice filled with conviction. I never want to live with Mom full time, no matter what her lawyer says about our family. You're the best dad in the world, and I want to keep living with you even if Grandpa Frank and Aunt Melody can't be nice to us. He paused for a moment before continuing with remarkable poise. I also want you to know that I wrote a letter to the judge who's deciding about where I should live, Tyler announced, pulling a folded piece of paper from his backpack. I wanted to make sure she understands how I feel about everything that's been happening. Frank and Melody stared at the letter with obvious alarm, clearly realizing that Tyler's testimony could have significant impact on the custody case. Would you like me to read part of my letter? Tyler asked, looking around the table at the adults who had underestimated him for so long. I nodded, genuinely curious about what Tyler had written to the family court judge. Tyler unfolded his letter and began reading in his clear, confident voice. Dear Judge Martinez, my name is Tyler and I'm 9 years old. My parents are divorced and my mom wants me to live with her all the time instead of half the time with each parent. I'm writing to tell you that I want to keep living with my dad because he's a good parent who takes care of me and teaches me important things. My mom's lawyer says my dad's family is mean to me, and that makes it a bad environment, but that's not my dad's fault. My dad always protects me and stands up for me when his family is unkind. I think that makes him a good parent, not a bad one. I've learned that some people in families can be mean or selfish, but that doesn't mean you should give up on the good people. My dad is a good person, and I want to keep being his son full time. Please don't make me live with my mom just because my grandpa and aunt haven't been nice to us. That would be punishing my dad for other people's mistakes. And that doesn't seem fair. Thank you for listening to me. Or the letter's impact was immediate and profound. Frank looked completely devastated as he realized that his behavior had not only hurt Tyler, but had also threatened Tyler's relationship with me. Melody was sobbing openly, clearly understanding that her actions had contributed to a legal battle that could tear apart Tyler's preferred living arrangement. Tyler folded his letter carefully and looked directly at Frank with the kind of direct honesty that only children possess. Grandpa Frank, I don't hate you, but I don't respect you either, Tyler said simply. You've been taking advantage of my dad's kindness while being cruel to both of us. That's not how good people behave. He turned to Melody with the same direct gaze. Aunt Melody, I think you're selfish and dishonest, but I hope you can learn to be better. Dad always says people can change if they really want to. The power of Tyler's words was amplified by the calm, matter-of-fact way he delivered them. He wasn't angry or vindictive. He was simply stating his observations with the clarity that comes from careful thought and genuine understanding. Frank finally looked up from his hands, his face streaked with tears as he met Tyler's steady gaze. Tyler, you're absolutely right about everything you've said. Frank admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I've been a terrible grandfather and a worse father to your dad. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope someday it can earn your respect. Tyler considered this statement seriously before responding. Grandpa Frank, respect isn't something you earn by asking for it, Tyler said with remarkable wisdom. You earn it by doing the right thing, even when it's hard, and being honest, even when it's embarrassing. If you want to start doing that, I'll pay attention to see if you mean it. 6 months later, as I sat in my home office reviewing the quarterly reports from my software consulting business, I found myself reflecting on the dinner that had fundamentally changed our family's dynamics forever. The mahogany table where we'd shared that confrontational meal now belonged to me officially, since Frank had signed over the deed to his house rather than face eviction. But more importantly, that evening had marked the beginning of genuine transformation for everyone involved. The most immediate change had been in the custody situation with Sandra. When Judge Martinez read Tyler's letter and reviewed the evidence of Frank and Melody's financial dependence on me, she made a ruling that surprised everyone involved. Rather than seeing my family's dysfunction as evidence of an unsuitable environment, she recognized it as proof that I was willing to protect Tyler from harmful influences regardless of the personal cost. The judge noted that a parent who would confront his own family to defend his child's emotional well-being was demonstrating exactly the kind of protective instinct courts want to see. Sandra's petition for full custody was denied, and our 50-50 arrangement remained in place. Frank had moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment, about 15 minutes from my house, close enough to maintain a relationship with Tyler, but far enough to give us all space to heal. The transition hadn't been easy for him. At 72 years old, he'd found himself truly independent for the first time in years, responsible for his own bills and grocery shopping. But the change had been remarkably positive. Without the financial safety net I'd been providing, Frank had been forced to confront his gambling addiction seriously. He'd joined Gamblers Anonymous and had been attending meetings twice a week for the past 5 months. The most surprising development had been Frank's relationship with Tyler. Once my father understood the extent of his grandson's actual capabilities, he'd become Tyler's most enthusiastic supporter. Frank had started attending Tyler's math competitions and programming demonstrations, often arriving early to get good seats and staying late to discuss the technical details with other parents. The pride in Frank's voice when he talked about Tyler's achievements was genuine and unmistakable. A complete reversal from his earlier dismissive attitude. Melody's transformation had been more gradual but equally significant. Facing potential criminal charges for fraud had been a wake-up call that forced her to examine her choices and priorities. She'd found a legitimate job with a small advertising agency downtown, earning about half what she'd made before her unemployment, but enough to cover her basic expenses. More importantly, she'd begun paying me back for the fraudulent business investment, sending me $200 every month along with handwritten notes expressing her gratitude and remorse. The relationship between Melody and Tyler had required the most careful rebuilding. Tyler's journal entries had made it clear that he'd lost trust in his aunt's character, and he wasn't interested in pretending that relationship could return to normal without significant effort on her part. Melody had started by writing Tyler a formal apology letter, acknowledging specifically how her words and actions had hurt him. She'd followed that with consistent behavior changes, asking Tyler about his programming projects and attending his academic competitions alongside Frank. Tyler himself had flourished in the new family dynamic. Without the constant undercurrent of criticism and comparison, he'd become more confident in sharing his achievements and interests. His MIT summer program had been an enormous success, leading to an invitation to participate in advanced research projects during the regular school year. More importantly, Tyler had maintained his remarkable emotional maturity, showing forgiveness toward Frank and Melody, while still holding firm boundaries about respectful treatment. The financial arrangements had been restructured to reflect the new family reality. I'd stopped paying Chloe's private school tuition, though I'd given Melody 6 months' notice to find alternative arrangements. Interestingly, Chloe had ended up transferring to Tyler's public school, where she'd discovered that academic success required more personal effort than she'd been accustomed to in her previous environment. The competition had been good for her, and she'd actually formed a friendship with Tyler based on their shared interest in advanced mathematics. Frank's medical expenses were now his own responsibility, though I'd helped him research Medicare supplement plans and prescription assistance programs. The monthly payment I'd been making toward Melody's car had ended, forcing her to either take over the payments herself or trade down to a more affordable vehicle. She'd chosen to keep the car and make the payments, viewing it as part of her commitment to financial independence. Perhaps the most significant change had been in the tone of our family gatherings. We'd started having monthly dinners again, but now they took place at my house with ground rules that everyone understood and respected. Conversations about the children focused on encouragement and genuine interest in their individual strengths. Academic achievements were celebrated for all the kids equally without comparisons or competitions. Most importantly, Tyler felt safe and valued in these new family interactions. The legal proceedings had ultimately been resolved without criminal charges. The district attorney's office had accepted a plea agreement where Melody admitted to the fraudulent business scheme and agreed to pay full restitution over 3 years. Frank's cooperation with the investigation and his testimony about his own role in the deception had helped convince the prosecutor that incarceration wasn't necessary for either of them. Sandra's relationship with Tyler had also improved significantly once the custody pressure was removed. Without the adversarial dynamic of the legal battle, she'd been able to focus on simply being Tyler's mother during his time with her. She'd even attended a few of his programming competitions where she'd met Frank and Melody in their new, more humble versions of themselves. As I finished reviewing my business reports and prepared to pick Tyler up from his after-school coding club, I thought about the life lesson that had emerged from that difficult family dinner 6 months earlier. I'd learned that protecting the people you love sometimes requires confronting the people who claim to love you. Family loyalty doesn't mean accepting disrespect or abuse. It means having the courage to demand better from the people who matter most. Tyler had taught me that children are far more perceptive than adults often realize, and that honesty about family dysfunction can be more helpful than trying to shield kids from difficult truths. His journal entries had shown me that he'd been suffering in silence while I'd been enabling harmful behavior in the name of keeping peace. Frank's transformation had demonstrated that people can change fundamental patterns of behavior when faced with real consequences for their actions. His gambling addiction and disrespectful attitude toward Tyler hadn't been fixed by gentle conversations or family meetings. They'd been addressed only when he'd faced the prospect of losing his home and his relationship with his grandson entirely. Melody's journey toward financial independence and personal responsibility had shown me that rescuing family members from the consequences of their poor choices often prevents them from developing the skills and character they need to succeed. By supporting her expenses without requiring accountability, I'd inadvertently enabled her dishonesty and irresponsibility. Most importantly, I'd learned that setting boundaries with family members doesn't mean you stop loving them. It means you love them enough to insist on mutual respect and honest relationships. The family dinners we shared now were more enjoyable and meaningful than they'd ever been when everyone was walking on eggshells or tolerating harmful behavior. Tyler bounded into the car with his usual enthusiasm, his backpack full of programming books, and his face bright with excitement about a new project he'd been working on. "How was coding club today, buddy?" I asked as we drove toward home. "Amazing," Tyler replied, pulling out his laptop to show me his latest creation. "I finished the multiplication game I've been working on, and Mrs. Patterson thinks it's good enough to submit to the state educational technology competition." As Tyler excitedly explained the features of his new educational game, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made the right choices for the right reasons. The confrontation at that family dinner had been painful and difficult, but it had led to a family dynamic based on mutual respect rather than dysfunctional patterns of enabling and resentment. "Dad," Tyler said as we pulled into our driveway, "do you think Grandpa Frank will want to see my new game when he comes over for dinner on Sunday?" "I'm sure he will," I replied, smiling at Tyler's casual assumption that his grandfather would be genuinely interested in his work. "He's been looking forward to hearing about your coding projects all week." As we walked into our house together, Tyler chattering excitedly about his programming ideas and weekend plans, I realized that the most important lesson from our family transformation was this: sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to accept less than you and your loved ones deserve, even when that refusal requires difficult conversations and painful changes. The strength to protect Tyler's emotional well-being and demand respectful treatment had come from recognizing that family relationships should be based on mutual care and support, not one-sided sacrifice and endurance of harmful behavior. By setting clear boundaries and enforcing real consequences, I'd created space for genuine healing and positive change to occur. Our family wasn't perfect now, but it was honest. Frank and Melody had learned that my kindness had limits, and that Tyler's confidence was non-negotiable. Tyler had learned that he was worth defending and that his achievements mattered regardless of other people's opinions. And I had learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable harmful behavior, even when that refusal creates temporary pain and conflict. The dinner table confrontation that had felt so devastating at the time had actually been the beginning of the most authentic and respectful family relationships we'd ever shared. Sometimes the courage to say no more is exactly what's needed to create space for something much better to grow. I hope sharing this story has given you some insight into the complex dynamics that can exist within families and the importance of protecting the people who matter most to you. Have you ever had to make difficult choices to defend someone you love from family members who were treating them poorly? How do you balance family loyalty with the need to set healthy boundaries? I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking this video to help others find it who might need to hear this message. Subscribing to the channel helps me continue sharing these real-life stories about family challenges and personal growth. And if you know someone who's struggling with similar family dynamics, please share this video with them. Sometimes knowing that others have faced these difficult choices can provide the courage needed to make positive changes. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community where we can share honest experiences about the challenges and triumphs of family life. I wish you and your loved ones the strength to build relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. Until next time, remember that protecting the people you love is always worth the temporary discomfort of difficult conversations.